It happened quietly at first. No dramatic press conference, no flashing lights on the steps of the courthouse, just a ruling. A few pages released by the Supreme Court instantly sent shockwaves through Washington, Wall Street, and every corner of the political world. The words were clinical, restrained, almost cold, but the meaning was unmistakable. The Trump Organization, as it has existed for decades, was ordered to be completely dissolved. For a moment, the noise stopped. Cable news anchors paused mid-sentence. Analysts stared at their screens. Even longtime Trump allies struggled to process what they were seeing. This was not a fine. This was not a temporary restriction. This was the court drawing a final line and saying this entity cannot continue. Within minutes, headlines exploded across the internet. Social media lit up with disbelief, celebration, outrage, and confusion. Supporters called it political persecution. Critics called it accountability long delayed. But everyone agreed on one thing. This was unprecedented. The Trump Organization was not just a business. It was a symbol, a brand intertwined with politics, power, and personal identity. To order its dissolution was to strike at something far larger than buildings and balance sheets. It was the legal system asserting dominance over a name that had spent years testing its limits. Then came the second shock. While politicians scrambled to react, one voice cut through the chaos with calm precision. Warren Buffett. No shouting, no partisan spin, just a measured response that immediately reframed the moment. Buffett did not talk about Trump. He talked about rules, about markets, about what happens when institutions finally enforce standards that everyone claims to respect but few expect to be applied evenly. That contrast mattered. Trump's world thrives on spectacle. Buffett's world runs on credibility. And when Buffett speaks during moments like this, investors listen, regulators listen, and history tends to take notes. This was no longer just a legal ruling. It was a signal, a message that power has limits. Brands are not shields, and even the most defiant empires can be dismantled when the system decides it has had enough. To understand why the Supreme Court took such a drastic step, we need to rewind the clock and trace the series of decisions, investigations, and controversies that led to this moment. The Trump Organization had long operated at the intersection of business and politics. But over the years, scrutiny intensified. From tax investigations to allegations of misleading lenders, from lawsuits over financial disclosures to civil claims, challenging the accuracy of reported assets, the pressure built. Each legal threat on its own might have seemed manageable, but together they formed a web that no court could ignore. Investigators meticulously documented discrepancies, tracing patterns of alleged misconduct across years. Real estate transactions, corporate filings, and financial statements were dissected line by line. Legal teams for both the state and private parties argued that the organization's structure allowed for repeated misuse and that the repeated violations indicated systemic problems rather than isolated mistakes. By the time the case reached the Supreme Court, lower courts had already issued findings that painted a troubling picture. Judges noted patterns of misrepresentation, internal communications that raised red flags, and financial practices that skirted legal boundaries. Appeals had been filed, delayed, and argued. Trump's legal team fought fiercely, citing precedent, technicalities, and the economic impact of such a ruling. But the courts were increasingly unconvinced. What made this situation extraordinary was not just the legal merit. It was the sheer scale and visibility. Every argument, every filing, every motion was dissected publicly, analyzed in the media, and debated by legal scholars. Unlike typical corporate dissolution cases, this one carried enormous political weight. Decisions here were never purely about accounting errors or procedural missteps. They were about accountability at the highest level and about whether the law could reach an entity synonymous with a former president. Even outside the courtroom, the pressure mounted. Investors were anxious, partners wary, and the media relentless. The organization's brand, once seen as untouchable, was suddenly vulnerable. And as the Supreme Court prepared to make its final decision, it became clear that history might not look kindly on those who assumed wealth. Fame and political influence were beyond scrutiny. This was not just another legal battle. This was a reckoning, a moment when long-standing power met the full force of the judicial system, and the world waited to see if even the most fortified empire could stand against it. When the Supreme Court released its ruling, the language was precise, unflinching, and legally airtight. The justices did not rely on dramatic rhetoric. They relied on facts, precedent, and careful interpretation of the law. The court stated that the Trump Organization had repeatedly misrepresented its assets and financial status in ways that violated corporate and civil regulations. Importantly, The justices emphasized that these patterns were not accidental or minor. They reflected systemic issues embedded in the company's structure. The ruling went beyond fines or restrictions. The court concluded that the organization's current structure was inherently incapable of operating within the law, without continuing violations. That assessment left only one remedy: full dissolution. By ordering the company to cease operations and liquidate assets, the court sent a clear message that legal safeguards would not tolerate ongoing misconduct, regardless of political influence or public visibility. Legal analysts immediately noted the historical weight of this decision. The ruling went beyond fines or restrictions. The court concluded that the organization's current structure was inherently incapable of operating within the law, without continuing violations. That assessment left only one remedy: full dissolution. By ordering the company to cease operations and liquidate assets, the court sent a clear message that legal safeguards would not tolerate ongoing misconduct, regardless of political influence or public visibility. Legal analysts immediately noted the historical weight of this decision. Corporate dissolutions of this magnitude are rare, especially when tied to politically prominent figures. The justices had to balance numerous factors: the impact on employees, creditors, and partners, alongside the principle that no individual or entity is above the law. By framing the dissolution as both corrective and preventive, the court ensured the ruling would resonate far beyond Trump's business empire. The decision also outlined oversight mechanisms. Courts will monitor the liquidation process to ensure assets are distributed appropriately and that no component of the organization continues business under misleading pretenses. Trustees will be appointed, reports submitted regularly, and financial records scrutinized for compliance. This is not merely a punishment. It is a structural reset. Immediately after the ruling, the legal community dissected the implications. If upheld, this decision sets a precedent for how courts can intervene in large corporations where leadership demonstrates repeated violations of law. It signals that reputation, political connections, or brand strength cannot shield executives from accountability. For Trump, the decision was devastating. It effectively dismantled a core source of wealth, influence, and leverage. For observers, it was a landmark moment, proof that even the most powerful organizations are ultimately subject to the rule of law. And for the public, it was a vivid illustration that the courts can act decisively when systemic wrongdoing is proven, regardless of the fame or political stature of those involved. The moment the Supreme Court ruling hit, the world outside the courtroom erupted. Financial markets, which had been quietly monitoring the case, responded almost immediately. Stocks tied to Trump Organization projects, luxury real estate ventures, and affiliated holdings saw sharp drops. Analysts scrambled to evaluate the broader economic ripple effects. The consensus was clear. The dissolution wasn't just symbolic. It would directly impact investors, partners, and markets tied to the empire. Media outlets ran non-stop coverage. Cable news channels interrupted regular programming to break down the ruling line by line, with legal analysts, former prosecutors, and corporate watchdogs weighing in. Headlines screamed about accountability, unprecedented judicial intervention, and the fall of a business empire that had long been intertwined with politics.